The great hall of the Galactic Assembly stretched for nearly a mile in every direction, its walls carved from the bones of an ancient moon and polished until they shone like mirrors. And within this sacred space, the representatives of 12 spacefaring species had gathered to discuss matters of war and survival. Though none of them knew that everything they believed about the universe was about to change forever. Ambassador Vela of the Kirethi delegation stood near the central platform, her forearms folded across her chest as she listened to the elder representative from the Morvani collective speak in hushed tones about the advancing threat. And around her the air buzzed with nervous energy as delegates whispered to one another about the Vorn Dominion and their ruthless campaign of conquest. They have taken 17 worlds in the past cycle, the Morvani elder announced, his voice trembling with age and fear. And our scouts report that their armada now turns toward the inner systems. A wave of murmurs swept through the assembly, and Vela felt her heart sink as she realized what this meant for her own people. For the Kirethi homeworld sat directly in the path of the Vorn advance, and her species had neither the ships nor the weapons to mount any meaningful defense. The Thelian ambassador, a tall creature with skin like polished stone, raised one massive hand and spoke in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder. "Perhaps we should consult the old records," he suggested. "For there are stories of beings who once challenged empires far greater than the Vorn." Several delegates laughed at this suggestion, and the Morvani elder shook his head with obvious disappointment. "You speak of fables," he replied, "of children's tales meant to frighten the young into obedience. And we have no time for such foolishness when real threats approach our borders." But the Thelian ambassador did not yield, and instead he activated a holographic display that showed an ancient star map with a region marked in red at the edge of an uncharted spiral arm. "The records speak of a death world called Earth," he continued, "a planet of extreme temperatures, deadly predators, and poison atmosphere. And from this hellish place emerged creatures of impossible endurance." Vela found herself leaning forward despite her skepticism, and she listened as the Thelian described the ancient warnings that had been passed down through countless generations. Warnings about bipedal beings with limited natural weapons, but unlimited determination. Creatures who could pursue prey for days without rest, who formed bonds with other species and fought to the death to protect them. They were called humans, the Thelian said, and the word hung in the air like a curse. And our ancestors feared them above all other things in the cosmos. The laughter returned, louder this time, and the assembly dismissed the old tales as nothing more than mythology. For no ship had ever returned from the uncharted arm, and no human had ever been seen by any living member of any known species. And surely if such dangerous creatures existed, they would have made themselves known by now. Vela said nothing, but she stored the information away in her mind as she returned her attention to the immediate crisis facing her people. Far across the galaxy, in a region of space that appeared empty on every scanner and telescope in the known universe, a ship called the Horizon's Edge drifted in perfect silence, its hull coated with materials that absorbed every form of radiation and reflected nothing back to watching eyes. Commander Daniel Cross sat in the captain's chair and studied the tactical display before him, his jaw tight with tension as he watched the Vorn armada move closer to Kirethi space. And beside him, Lieutenant Maria Santos worked the sensor station with practiced efficiency. "Vorn fleet has increased speed," Santos reported, her voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. "At current trajectory, they will reach the Kirethi homeworld in approximately 32 standard hours." Cross nodded slowly and rubbed his tired eyes with one hand, for he had been monitoring this situation for weeks, watching as the Vorn conquered world after world while the Galactic Assembly debated and discussed, and ultimately did nothing to stop them. "How many civilians on the Kirethi homeworld?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Estimated population of 4 billion, Santos replied. With no significant military presence and limited evacuation capability, the weight of those numbers pressed down on Cross like a physical force. And he thought about what his grandmother had told him when he was young, about how humanity had once turned its back on those in need, and how that failure had haunted them for generations. Earth had been watching the stars for over 200 years, building ships and training crews and developing technology that far surpassed anything the galaxy had ever seen. And yet they had chosen to remain hidden, to observe without interfering, to let the other species chart their own course through history. But watching innocents march toward slaughter felt different somehow, felt wrong in a way that Cross could not ignore. He opened a secure channel to Earth and requested an immediate conference with the Defense Coalition. And within minutes, the holographic images of 12 admirals and council members flickered to life around the bridge. Admiral Patricia Cole appeared at the center of the group. Her gray hair pulled back severely and her eyes sharp with intelligence. "Commander Cross," she said, "I assume you are calling about the Kirathi situation." "Yes, Admiral," Cross replied. "The Vorn will reach their homeworld within 2 days, and the Assembly has offered nothing but words and sympathy, and I believe we need to discuss our options." The council members exchanged glances, and Cross could see the conflict playing out on their faces. The eternal struggle between safety and conscience that had defined humanity since the beginning of time. "You are suggesting intervention," Cole said, and it was not a question. Cross straightened in his chair and met her gaze without flinching. "I am suggesting that we stop hiding," he answered, "because staying safe means nothing if we have to watch 4 billion innocent beings die to achieve it." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. And somewhere in the depths of space, the Vorn Armada continued its relentless advance toward a people who had no idea that their salvation might come from a species they believed existed only in ancient nightmares and forgotten legends. The Kirathi defense fleet numbered only 47 ships, and as Ambassador Vela watched from the observation deck of the Assembly Station, she knew that her people were sending their sons and daughters to die in a battle that could not be won. The Vorn Armada filled the tactical display like a swarm of metal insects. Over 300 warships armed with weapons that could crack planets and shields that had never been breached. And they moved with the terrible confidence of predators who had never known defeat. "All Kirathi vessels, this is Fleet Commander Torath," a voice crackled over the emergency broadcast. "We will hold the line as long as possible to allow civilian transports to evacuate. May the ancestors guide our aim and steady our hearts." Vela pressed her 4 hands against the cold glass of the observation window and whispered a prayer she had learned as a child, a prayer to God she was no longer certain existed. And around her, the delegates of a dozen species watched in solemn silence as the slaughter began. The first Kirathi ships disappeared in brilliant flashes of light as Vorn plasma batteries tore through their inadequate shields. And within minutes, the defense fleet had been reduced by half, while the enemy armada had suffered no casualties at all. "We must do something," Vela shouted, turning to face the assembled representatives. "You cannot simply stand here and watch my people die." The Morvani elder lowered his eyes in shame, and the Thelian ambassador shook his massive head with genuine sorrow. But neither of them spoke. For what could they say when the truth was that their own species lacked the power to challenge the Vorn? "I'm sorry, Ambassador Vela," the elder finally replied. "But intervention would mean the destruction of our own worlds. And we cannot sacrifice our children to save yours." Vela wanted to scream at them, wanted to tear down the walls of this sacred hall and force them to fight. But deep in her hearts, she understood their fear, understood that they were not evil, but simply afraid. And fear had always been the true enemy of compassion across the galaxy. In the hidden council chamber of the Earth Defense Coalition, Admiral Patricia Cole listened as Commander Cross made his case for intervention. And around her, the other admirals and council members debated with increasing intensity. "We have remained hidden for 2 centuries," Admiral Kenneth Walsh argued, his voice heavy with caution. "And revealing ourselves now could invite the very wars we sought to avoid." "Wars will come whether we hide or not," Cross replied. "But at least if we act now, we can choose what kind of species we want to be." Council member Linda Torres leaned forward in her seat and fixed Cross with a penetrating stare. "Commander, do you understand what you are asking us to do?" she demanded. "You are asking us to risk the safety of 8 billion human beings for aliens we have never met." Cross met her gaze without wavering. "I am asking us to be human," he answered simply. "Because our ancestors did not survive ice ages and plagues and wars just so we could watch innocent people burn from the shadows." The debate continued for nearly an hour, voices rising and falling as old arguments clashed with new realities. And through it all, Admiral Cole remained silent, her eyes fixed on the tactical display that showed the Kirathi fleet being systematically destroyed. Finally, she raised her hand and the chamber fell silent. "We will vote," she announced. "All in favor of intervention." The count was close, closer than Cross had hoped. But when the final tally was complete, the decision had been made, and humanity would no longer be a fable whispered in the dark. Cole turned to Cross and nodded once. "Commander, you will make first contact," she ordered. "The intervention fleet will follow within the hour. And may God help us all." The Horizon's Edge dropped out of fold space directly between the Vaughn Armada and the last Kirathi refugee convoy. And for a moment, that seemed to stretch into infinity, nothing moved and nothing breathed, and the universe itself held still. Ambassador Vela stared at the new contact on her display and felt her heart stop beating. For the ship that had appeared from nowhere matched the ancient description she had heard just days before. Angular and predatory, with symbols on its hull that looked exactly like the cave paintings found on a dozen worlds. "What is that?" the Morvani elder whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. "A transmission broadcast on all frequencies, cutting through the chaos of battle with crystal clarity." And the voice that spoke was calm and firm and carried an authority that demanded attention. "This convoy is under human protection," Commander Cross announced. "All Vorn vessels will withdraw immediately or face consequences." The word human echoed through the assembly station like thunder, and Vela watched as delegates who had laughed at ancient legends now stood frozen with shock and fear. On the Vorn flagship, Commander Drask studied the strange vessel with contempt, for it was small and alone, and his armada numbered over 200 ships, and he had never encountered an enemy foolish enough to challenge such overwhelming force. "One ship," he snarled to his officers. "They send one ship to threaten the Vorn Dominion. Destroy it and continue the advance." 20 Vorn warships turned their weapons toward the Horizon's Edge and opened fire with enough power to crack a small moon. And Vela closed her eyes because she could not bear to watch the Fable die. But the explosion she expected never came. And when she opened her eyes again, she saw something that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. The human ship dancing through a storm of plasma fire like it was guided by spirits, twisting and spinning in ways that seemed to mock the very laws of physics. And then the Horizon's Edge began to fire back. The weapons of the Horizon's Edge carved through Vorn shields like they were made of nothing but wishes and prayers. And Commander Drask watched in growing horror as 3 of his warships broke apart under fire from a vessel that should have been destroyed in the first volley. "Impossible," he hissed, his claws digging into the armrest of his command chair. "How can one ship damage our fleet?" But the tactical display told a story that his mind refused to accept. For the human vessel moved with a speed and precision that no species in the known galaxy could match. Its pilot anticipating attacks before they were launched and finding gaps in formations that should not have existed. Commander Daniel Cross gripped the flight controls with white-knuckled intensity as he pushed the horizon's edge, through maneuvers that would have killed any pilot not trained in the crushing gravity of Earth. And beside him, Lieutenant Maria Santos coordinated their weapons fire with surgical precision. 3 more ships disabled, Santos reported, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. But we are taking damage. Hull breaches on decks 4 through 7. Cross knew they could not hold much longer. Knew that one ship against an armada was a mathematical certainty of defeat, no matter how skilled the crew. But every minute they bought was another minute for the refugee convoy to escape. "Get me a channel to the convoy," he ordered, "and prepare to transfer tactical command to you." Santos turned to face him with understanding in her eyes. "Daniel, what are you planning?" "Someone needs to keep the Vorn focused on us," Cross replied. "And someone needs to make sure those civilians reach safety. I trust you to do what needs to be done." Before Santos could argue, the ship shuddered under another impact. And Cross made his decision in that split second of chaos, ejecting her escape pod toward the convoy, while he turned the damaged vessel directly into the heart of the enemy formation. The Vorn ships swarmed around him like predators sensing wounded prey, and Cross smiled grimly as he drew their attention away from the fleeing refugees, knowing that his sacrifice would matter even if no one ever knew his name. But the universe had other plans. Space itself seemed to tear open as 30 human vessels emerged from fold space in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with the cold light of distant stars. And at the head of this fleet flew the carrier Steadfast Valor, with Admiral Patricia Cole standing on its bridge. "All human vessels, engage at will," Cole commanded, her voice carrying the weight of 2 centuries of preparation. "Show them what humanity can do." The Vorn had never faced anything like what came next. For human tactics were born from a world where survival required cooperation and creativity, where ancient tribes had hunted creatures 10 times their size through patience and teamwork and sheer stubborn determination. Human ships feinted and flanked, drew enemies into traps, and struck from unexpected angles. And the Vorn commanders who had conquered dozens of worlds found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. "They fight like nothing we have ever seen," a Vorn officer reported to Commander Drask. "They coordinate without visible signals, anticipate our movements before we make them." Drask watched his fleet crumble and felt something he had never experienced in his long career of conquest. He felt fear, but the true shock came when human marines boarded the damaged Vorn vessels. For no species had engaged in close combat for over 1,000 years, and the Vorn had forgotten what it meant to face an enemy hand to hand. The humans came through breached hulls in armored suits, their movements economical and precise, and they fought with a controlled ferocity that seemed almost supernatural, taking down Vorn warriors twice their size through techniques perfected over millennia of conflict. Private First Class Raymond Ortiz led his squad through the corridors of a Vorn cruiser, his rifle steady as he cleared each junction with practiced efficiency. And behind him his team moved like extensions of his own body, each soldier knowing exactly where the others would be without needing to look. "Contact left," someone shouted, and Ortiz pivoted smoothly to engage 3 Vorn soldiers who emerged from a side passage. The fight was brief and brutal, and when it ended, the humans stood victorious over enemies who had never lost a battle until today. On the assembly station, Ambassador Vela watched the impossible unfold on her display, watched as the fables of her childhood became flesh and blood warriors who bled and died to protect people they had never met. "They are real," the Marvani elder whispered, and his voice trembled with emotions that had no names. "The humans are real." The Thelian ambassador stood in silence, his ancient eyes fixed on the battle as ships exploded and marines fought, and the Vorn armada slowly began to collapse under the weight of human determination. "Why?" Vela asked, though she directed the question at no one in particular. Why would they reveal themselves for us? Why would they risk everything for strangers? No one could answer her because no one understood. Because the concept of sacrificing safety for compassion was foreign to species who had evolved in gentler worlds. The battle turned decisively when Admiral Cole ordered a concentrated strike on the Vorn flagship. And human ships converged from all directions to pour fire into Commander Drask's vessel until its shields finally failed. "All Vorn forces withdraw," Drask commanded, his pride burning as hot as his damaged ship. "Retreat to the border. This battle is lost." The enemy armada fled in disarray, leaving behind dozens of destroyed vessels and thousands of captured soldiers. And as the last Vorn ship disappeared into fold space, a strange silence fell over the battlefield. Lieutenant Santos had reached the refugee convoy safely, and now she watched from a transport window as human ships moved through the debris field, searching for survivors from both sides with equal dedication. Commander Cross was found in the wreckage of the Horizon's Edge, barely alive but still breathing. His hands still wrapped around the flight controls, as if he refused to let go even in unconsciousness. And across the galaxy, on worlds that had dismissed humans as nothing but stories told to frighten children, people stared at their displays and realized that everything they thought they knew about the universe had just changed forever. The medical bay of the Steadfast Valor hummed with quiet activity as human doctors worked alongside Kirathi healers to treat the wounded from both species. And in a private room near the back, Commander Daniel Cross lay unconscious while machines monitored his failing vital signs. Lieutenant Maria Santos stood beside his bed and held his hand. Her eyes red from tears she had not allowed herself to shed until now, and she whispered words of encouragement that she hoped he could hear somewhere in the darkness. "You did it, Daniel," she said softly. "You saved them. You saved all of them." The Horizon's Edge had been destroyed beyond any hope of repair. Its hull breached in 17 places, and its reactor core cracked from the strain of maneuvers. No ship was designed to survive. But the crew had been recovered and the refugees had escaped, and that was all that mattered in the end. Admiral Patricia Cole entered the room and placed a gentle hand on Santos's shoulder. "How is he?" she asked. "The doctors say he has a chance," Santos replied. "His body took tremendous damage from the G-forces. But humans are stubborn creatures." Cole nodded slowly and looked down at the man who had started all of this with a single question about what kind of species humanity wanted to be. He certainly proved it today. Outside the medical bay, the galaxy was in chaos. For news of the human intervention had spread across every network and communication channel, and species who had believed themselves alone in the universe now faced the terrifying reality that the Death World legends were true. The Galactic Assembly demanded answers, and Admiral Cole knew that she could not delay this confrontation any longer. So she left the medical bay and boarded a shuttle that would take her to the Great Hall, where representatives of 12 species waited with fear and wonder and 1,000 questions. She walked into the chamber alone, her gray hair pulled back and her uniform crisp despite the long hours of battle. And she met the eyes of every delegate without flinching as she approached the central platform. "I am Admiral Patricia Cole of the Earth Defense Coalition," she announced, her voice echoing through the vast space. "And I have come to explain why humanity has revealed itself after 200 years of silence." The Marvani elder rose from his seat with trembling limbs. "You have watched us all this time?" he demanded. "You have observed our struggles and our wars and said nothing?" "Yes," Cole admitted without hesitation. "We have watched, and we have waited. Because we were afraid." A murmur of confusion rippled through the assembly. For how could beings who had just defeated the Vorn Armada be afraid of anything? Cole continued, her voice heavy with the weight of history. "Humanity has a violent past, a past filled with wars and atrocities and failures that shame us to this day. And when we first discovered that we were not alone in the universe, we feared what we might become. We feared that our worst instincts would lead us to conquer rather than cooperate. She paused and let her words sink in before speaking again. So we chose to hide, to develop our technology in secret, to watch and learn and hope that we could become worthy of the stars before we introduced ourselves to those who lived among them. And what changed? The Thelian ambassador asked, his deep voice curious rather than hostile. Cole turned to face him directly. "The Vorn happened," she answered. And suddenly hiding felt like cowardice, felt like betrayal. Because we had the power to save innocent lives, and choosing not to use that power would have made us complicit in their deaths. Ambassador Vela rose from her seat and walked toward the platform, her forearms hanging at her sides as she approached the human who had ordered the fleet that saved her people. "You lost soldiers today," Vela said. "Human beings died protecting Karithi civilians they had never met. Why would you pay such a price for strangers?" Cole was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer than before. "There is something you need to understand about humans," she began. "We evolved on a world that tried to kill us every single day. A world of predators and poisons and disasters that should have destroyed us 1,000 times over." She gestured to herself. To her scarred hands and weathered face, "We survived because we learned to protect each other. Because the pack that fights together lives while the individual dies alone. And that instinct became coded into our very nature." Vela listened with all four of her hearts beating in her chest. "So you protect because it is who you are." "We protect because we cannot imagine being any other way," Cole confirmed. "Human parents die for their children without hesitation. Human soldiers throw themselves on explosives to save their comrades. Human strangers run into burning buildings to rescue people they have never met." She stepped closer to Vela and spoke with complete sincerity. "When we saw your people facing extinction, something in our collective soul refused to look away. Because abandoning the innocent is not something humans can do. Not when we have the power to help." The assembly sat in stunned silence as they absorbed this revelation. And slowly the fear in the room began to transform into something else. Something that might have been respect or perhaps even gratitude. Vela reached out with one hand and touched Admiral Cole's arm. A gesture of connection that transcended the differences between their species. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for caring when no one else would." Cole covered Vela's hand with her own and smiled for the first time since the battle began. "That is all the reason we have ever needed." 3 weeks after the battle that changed the galaxy forever, the Vorn Dominion sent envoys to the Galactic Assembly with an offer of complete surrender. And representatives who had once trembled at the mention of Vorn warships now watched in amazement as the greatest military power in known space agreed to withdraw from every conquered world. The Vorn commander who delivered the message stood before the assembly with his head bowed in shame. "We do not wish to face human tactics again," he admitted. "Your fleet destroyed our confidence as surely as it destroyed our ships. And we have learned that conquest is not worth the price humanity would make us pay." Admiral Patricia Cole accepted the surrender with grace and dignity, demanding only that the Vorn release all prisoners and provide compensation to the worlds they had harmed. And when the terms were agreed upon, she extended her hand to the Vorn envoy in a gesture of peace that surprised everyone in the chamber. "We did not come to the stars to make enemies," she told him. "We came to find neighbors. And neighbors can disagree without destroying each other." The Vorn looked at her hand for a long moment before taking it in his own clawed grip. And something shifted in his eyes that might have been the beginning of respect, with the war officially ended. The Galactic Assembly turned its attention to the question of humanity's place among the stars. And after debates that lasted for days, the vote was finally called. 11 species voted to offer Earth full membership in the Assembly. with all the rights and responsibilities that came with such recognition, and only the Vorn abstained, though their envoy indicated that this was not a rejection, but simply an acknowledgement that they needed time to adjust. Ambassador Vela delivered the formal invitation to Admiral Cole, and his ceremony broadcast to trillions of viewers across the galaxy. On behalf of the Galactic Assembly, she announced, I hereby invite the species known as humans to take their place among the stars as equals and partners in the great work of civilization. Cole accepted with a simple nod and words that would echo through history. We are honored to join you, and we promise to be worthy of your trust on the Kirathi homeworld. In a medical facility donated by the human fleet, Commander Daniel Cross finally opened his eyes after weeks of unconsciousness. And the first thing he saw was Lieutenant Maria Santa smiling down at him with tears streaming down her face. Welcome back, she said, her voice cracking with emotion. You had me worried. Cross tried to speak but found his throat too dry. And Santos quickly brought him water while explaining everything that had happened since the battle. The victory, the surrender, the invitation to join the assembly, all of it. We did it, Cross whispered when he could finally form words. We actually did it. Santa squeezed his hand and nodded. You did it, Daniel. You showed the galaxy what humanity could be. Over the following days, Cross received visitors from nearly every species in the assembly. Delegates and civilians who wanted to meet the human who had risked everything to protect strangers. And each of them brought gifts or words of gratitude that made him uncomfortable in ways he could not explain. But one visitor stood out above all the others. A young Kirathi child, no more than 6 years old by human standards, walked into his room with wide eyes and trembling limbs, accompanied by her mother, who watched from the doorway with tears in her eyes. The child approached the bed slowly and stared at Cross with obvious wonder. Are you really from the death world? She asked in a small voice. Cross smiled gently and nodded. Yes, I am from Earth. My grandmother told me stories about your people, the child continued. She said you were monsters who ate entire planets and drank the blood of stars. Cross laughed softly despite the pain in his chest. We are not quite that frightening, he assured her. Though I admit our world did teach us to be strong. The child reached out and touched his hand with her small fingers, and her eyes went wide at the warmth of his skin. But you saved my family, she said. Grandmother said monsters do not save people. Maybe the stories were wrong, Cross suggested. Or maybe they only told part of the truth. The child considered this for a moment before nodding with the simple acceptance that only children possess. I think you are good monsters, she decided. The kind that protects people instead of hurting them. Her mother stepped forward and gathered the child in her arms, bowing her head to Cross with gratitude that words could not express. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for giving my daughter a future. Cross watched them leave and felt something warm bloom in his chest that had nothing to do with his healing wounds. And he understood in that moment why humanity had been right to step out of the shadows. The final ceremony took place in the Great Hall of the Galactic Assembly, where Ambassador Vela had been chosen to deliver a speech that would officially welcome humanity to the community of civilized species. She stood at the central platform and looked out at delegates from 13 worlds, including the human delegation led by Admiral Cole, and she spoke with a voice that carried the weight of history. For 3,000 years, we told stories about humanity, she began. Stories of monsters from a death world, of creatures with impossible endurance and terrifying strength. And we believed these tales were nothing but fables invented to frighten children. She paused and let her gaze sweep across the chamber. We were wrong. Humanity is real, and they are exactly as dangerous as the old stories claimed. A murmur of uncertainty rippled through the assembly. But Vela raised her hand for silence. They're also exactly as compassionate, she continued. For the same strength that makes humans fearsome in battle makes them unstoppable in defense of the innocent. The same endurance that allows them to chase prey for days allows them to never give up on those who need their help. Her voice grew stronger as she approached her conclusion. We feared the wrong thing all these years. We feared human wrath when we should have feared a universe without human kindness. She turned to face the human delegation directly. Welcome to the stars, humanity. We are grateful you chose to share them with us. Admiral Cole rose and bowed her head in acknowledgement. And around her, the assembly erupted in applause that echoed through the ancient hall like thunder. 1 week later, the steadfast Valor departed for Earth, carrying ambassadors from 7 different species who wished to see the death world that had produced such remarkable beings. And as the ship entered Fold Space, Commander Cross stood at a viewport and watched the stars blur into streaks of light. Maria Santos joined him, and together they looked toward the future that humanity had finally chosen to embrace. Do you think we made the right choice? She asked. Cross smiled and nodded slowly. The fable has ended, he replied, but the story is just beginning. And somewhere in the depths of space, on worlds that had once believed themselves alone, people looked up at the stars and knew that the universe would never be the same.